All right, so we are here in the studio with Sarah Stonbely, our research director here at the Center for Cooperative Media, and we're going to take a slightly different track for our final show of 2018. Normally, for those who are avid listeners of this program, and I know all of you are, we usually take a research paper, a report, or a handful of reports that are related to each other and dive into them and talk about them here on Research Corner, as the name suggests. We're going to take a slightly different track for this. We have, I've been reading the book, The Anatomy of Fascism by Robert O. Paxton, who is affectionately known as the grandfather of fascism studies. And he wrote this book in 2004. And I've been reading it. I've been fascinated by it and terrified by it all at the same time. And I've been sort of relentlessly pushing this on everyone I've spoken to. And Sarah has graciously agreed to indulge me. And I think the reaction so far has been pretty positive. It holds up.
It's
right?
a great book, from what I can tell from the introduction.
So we're going to talk a little bit about it today. And I highly recommend you either go out, rent, or buy, or check out this book from your library and at least read the introduction, because introductory paragraphs or chapters in books the goal is to sort of suck the reader in and give them the flash, the razzle dazzle to get them to keep turning the pages. This accomplishes that, but as I continue to go through the chapters, they are no less substantive as well. So
I actually ordered it on Amazon after I finished reading the introduction. So.
Fantastic. Yep. I think that has accomplished the goal has been there.
It did.
So let's start with some basic stuff. Let's talk about some definitions, as we usually do in a Research Corner. What are we talking about when we say fascism?
So, I think one of the things that he says in the introduction is that he's going to save the definition till the end.
Yes. And this is an important point.
But it's an important methodological point, exactly, because what he says is it's an overused term. And one of the reasons why Joe and I were thinking it would be an interesting thing to talk about this week is because of, the news about the investigations into Trump and all of his organizations and, sort of this heightening of the rhetoric around the evils of Trump, which are becoming so much more apparent every day.
Not to mention almost every other thing that he's done.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
Yeah, news hooks abound.
And they do. And so I think so the term is overused. And I think one of the things that Paxton says in the introduction, he does give some definition, which I'm sure we'll get into, but he also says, I'm going to save the definition as sort of a methodological tactic. I'm going to save it till the end after we've really examined the two most well-known forms of
manifestations I guess.
of fascism, which were, of course, Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany.
So he does get into, and this is such an academic and researching thing to do, is to hedge so hard on giving any concrete definition, but he really does.
He does.
He lays out the definition of fascism from a historical and also almost like a prosecutorial way. He really builds the case for what this is. And on the one hand, so he talks, and I can't find the exact page, but he does talk about if fascism existed when it was first spoken, when the word fascism was first spoken, then it was in the early 1900s with Mussolini, who the Fasci Party, basically. He had a specific word for it. Fasci comes from that group, basically a very violent organization, political organization that took power in the early 1900s. So in name, and specifically fascism, it did start with Mussolini. But Paxton argues throughout the introduction and throughout the book that fascism itself, the movement, the philosophy, the issue, the ideas, and the structures of it can be seen, and its manifestations can be seen and are represented differently in different contexts. And so this really was one of the points that struck with me most. And at its core, fascism is a rapid or rampant consolidation of power and an exercise of that political power against the left and against vulnerable populations in some ways. But it takes the structure and it takes the appearance based on the historical and cultural realities of the country or the community or society that it takes form in. Right. So, for instance, we would see, there are a lot of people who compare Trump to Hitler, continue to do so. They compare him to Mussolini, I think would be a more apt comparison. We can talk about that later. But really what some people argue is that fascism should not be called fascism unless we're talking about Italy. It should be called Nazism in Germany. And in the United States, a more apt word to be used would be Trumpism. And I think Even More News makes a great point there, or Some More News. They make a great point, a YouTube channel there. Cody Johnston talks about this, but that's the thing that struck me. It is not going to be seen. You are not likely to see a fascism in America take the form of Nazi salutes and swastikas or white nationalist rhetoric in that way, although those things are prevalent and, in fact, increasingly prevalent in an environment that fascism creates in America. Rather, fascism in America or American fascism would more likely take the form of the cultural signifiers and social signifiers that are laden throughout our history. So, for instance, an opposition towards people of color, indigenous peoples, immigrants, the enemy within sort of a thing. And I think that's the sort of big takeaway that I got that I found most interesting, because that was what sort of made it click for me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, well, I think that's one of the themes that he identifies, Paxton, between, one of the common themes of the manifestations of fascism is that there is a dominant race in the view of the people who are practicing fascism, who are in a winner take all struggle against all others. And
right, there's an in, there's the in and the out group.
It's the Jews in Germany, it's the more like political groups in Italy, and here clearly it's been people of color, and Trump has certainly waged war on immigrants and Muslims and people who are
football players.
Yeah. And so that is certainly like one of the common themes of fascism that Paxton identifies. Some other ones are interesting too. There's a rejection of the establishment, and we see that clearly with Trump. And then there's also a complicity amongst people, everyday, ordinary people, right? And
yes.
he talks about Kristallnacht in Germany and how people were horrified by it, but within the context, they didn't speak out about it. They didn't bring court cases about it. They didn't do anything. They just kind of like let it pass. And that created an even wider opening for further atrocities later on, which is another sort of hallmark, is that there has to be complicity amongst like most people, because most people aren't going to be like this rabid, fervent fascist, but they'll be complicit to the point where they'll allow it to happen. Yeah.
I think another thing that he mentions is on page 19. He talks about some of the causes or contributing factors to the birth of fascism. And it's something that we hear, or we have heard a lot, that has led or supposed to have led to the election of Trump, sort of the economic uncertainty. And I'm just going to read it real quick here from page 19. This is Robert Paxton. No sound strategy for studying fascism can fail to examine the entire context in which it was formed and grew. Some approaches to fascism start with the crisis to which fascism was a response, at the risk of making the crisis into a cause. A crisis of capitalism, according to Marxists, gave birth to fascism. Unable to assure ever-expanding markets, ever-widening access to raw materials, and ever-willing cheap labor through the normal operation of constitutional regimes and free markets, capitalists were obliged, Marxists say, to find a new way to attain these ends by force. I think it's a key, because if you remember during the 2015-2016 campaign, we heard a lot about NAFTA. We heard a lot about manufacturing going away, the economic uncertainty and depression, and the latent effects of the Great Recession of 2008, sort of setting the stage for that economic anxiety, as it's called, among the white working class, if you will. That in part allowed Trump to sort of distance himself from the other crowded GOP field, is because he was the only one talking about how our trade deals were getting killed on trade deals, or our manufacturer. I'm going to go and tell Carrier that they better keep their factory here. And all this rhetoric, is built around this economic anxiety and economic nationalism. But on top of that, though, you notice when he is elected, the coherence of that rhetoric, a lot of the early promises drift away.
It's just rhetoric.
Because at its core, fascism is an appeal to and a consolidation of power. And I'm going to go back to page 16 here.
Yep.
Fascism, by contrast, was a new invention created afresh for the era of mass politics. It sought to appeal mainly to the emotions by the use of ritual, carefully stage-managed ceremonies, and intensely charged rhetoric. Fascism does not rest explicitly on an elaborated philosophical system, but rather upon popular feelings about master races, their unjust lot, and their rightful predominance over inferior peoples. Skipping down, fascism is true insofar as it helps fulfill the destiny of a chosen race or people or blood, locked with other peoples in a Darwinian struggle, and not in the light of some abstract and universal reason. Can you talk a little bit about that? You highlighted that part as well in the book.
Yeah, I did. Well, I thought that was really important because he says earlier a really nice turn of phrase, and can I find it really quickly? Something about like the pure instrumentalism of truth or something like that.
Yes.
Which is so
Page 18.
So clear with Trump and, you know, this whole idea of fake news, the radical instrumentalization of truth. And this whole idea of there's no core set of principles. And again, Trump, it's there.
I'll say whatever it takes as long as I stay on top.
As long as I don't care if I contradict myself. I'll
and
contradict myself gladly.
Yeah.
And I'll dare you to call me out on it. And if you do, I'll be like, oh yeah,
I don't care. He's literally
he doesn't care.
He's like, I don't care. I'll shut down the government. I'll do whatever I want.
There's no coherent set of principles behind what he says. It's just all what gets him ahead in the moment. And he assumes correctly for the most part that people who like what he says don't care that he doesn't do it. They just want to hear someone say that out loud. And so this is another really important aspect of fascism that we see so clearly with Trump. And it's terrifying. I mean, when you think about what, the subsequent history of these movements in these other countries.
Yeah.
It's really terrifying.
It also helps to explain why, as Paxton says, that there's never been a successful export of nationalism or fascism to an international framework.
Right.
It is not an export. It is strictly nationalist and internally focused.
Yeah, but that reminds me, though, when you were saying, sorry to interrupt you, but when you were saying earlier that, you know, the economic conditions had sort of created the fertile grounds for fascism. And then I noted on page 7 how he talks about that when Mussolini was coming to power, similar movements were springing up in post-war Europe independently of Mussolini's fascism, but expressing the same mixture of nationalism, anti-capitalism, volunteerism, and active violence against both bourgeois and socialistic enemies. And that is really important because it's what we see with Brexit. It's what we're seeing in France. It's what we're seeing. So we have Poland. So we have these other similar economic contexts in similar places, and you know, it's you see similar things happening, but they're all sort of very specific to their own cultural context.
And let's not forget about ISIS, and let's not forget about Turkey and Erdogan.
Yeah.
I mean, these authoritarian regimes, ranging from authoritarian to totalitarian in the case of ISIS, they're not. I mean, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and a caliphate is what else but a religious a theocratic ethnostate or a dictatorial, totalitarian religious nation, a nationalism for religious.
Page 8,
religious
fascism
zealots.
is the open, territoristic dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinist, and most imperialist elements of finance capital.
Yes. And so this is a good point. The chauvinism part is particularly interesting.
Right.
In every fascist movement that he studies in this book, he notes a strong through line of chauvinism, misogyny, and anti-feminism in that way. And I don't think they explicitly used the word feminism at the time. He talks about the strategies for consolidating power and the difference between how, and it's sort of internal struggle between how men and women who both supported the cause of Mussolini or of Hitler struggled internally with their response to that blatant chauvinism and the calls to return women to a more traditional role in society, while they uplifted the chauvinist and the male roles as the main characters essentially. But it really is it is a reaction to socialism and the left. It is a reaction to feminism and the left. It is a reaction to the resurgence or the rise or perceived rise in influence and social power of traditionally marginalized groups. It is the patriarchy on steroids, essentially.
Right.
Combined with finance capital and the interests of sort of free markets and profit first kind of a mentality, which is where you see a lot of the business cooperation from industrialists.
Yeah, one of the other things I wanted to mention, sort of picking up on that tangentially, on page 18, he says, the intellectuals of the early days had several kinds of major impact. First, they helped create a space for fascist movements by weakening the elite's attachment to Enlightenment values, until then very widely accepted. That is so key in my mind because I'm thinking about this country back to like the 60s and 70s. And, there were several things happening, right? Conservatives were reacting to the feminist movement, civil rights movement. They built very, very patiently and meticulously, this intellectual structure of think tanks, Heritage Foundation, They had
the Weekly Standard.
The Weekly
apparently,
Standard.
yeah.
All of these like propaganda machines, basically. They did it over decades.
And then Fox News.
Fox
yep.
News, Rush Limbaugh, all of these sort of very carefully built, sort of propaganda machine that they began in the 60s and has come to fruition now, and maybe arguably did in roughly the mid-90s.
Mm-hmm.
But so took the idea that liberals had used to talk about the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, that, sort of all viewpoints are equally diverse. All diverse viewpoints are equal.
Fair and balanced, yeah.
All diverse viewpoints are equal. All have merit.
Yeah.
And they sort of turned that in a very, like, twisted way on its head to say, well, if into a relativism, right? They pushed it over the edge into relativism. And they said, well, if all viewpoints are valid, then I'm going to say whatever I want, and I'm going to say it's true. Or I'm not going to care if it's not true, and I'm just going to say it for instrumentalist ends.
You take that, though, and you look at something like the Weekly Standard, which posited itself as the sort of intellectual conservatism magazine. It's our opinion magazine that cultivates the best and most rigorous of conservative thought leadership. And I think, and the pattern that I'm seeing in this, you go back to the 70s and the 60s with Buckley, William F. Buckley, and that sort of intellectual appreciation for a conservative thought.
Right.
You trace that over the years to the launch of Fox News, the widespread, popularity and ubiquity of talk radio, conservative talk radio, and you look at the rise of things like InfoWars and right-wing conspiracy media. To me, it makes sense that the Weekly Standard would close because over time, you had this sort of separation between high-minded conservative thought and a sort of guttural base sort of conspiracy theory and fear-mongering. After a while, there's no difference anymore. And you can see that whether it's Fox News or the lack of your sort of institutional establishment conservative voices, that's gone anymore because the elites and the bottom of the barrel conservative thoughts have merged over the last decades because of the increasing demands of the market, the profitability aspect. If it's not profitable, it's not going to exist. And what became profitable and how the elites sort of created space on the right and on the left, and we'll get to that in a second, for this sort of a fascism to arise, it absolutely is tied to the intellectual and communication space that allows these kinds of ideology-free or philosophical structure and consistency-free tangents to happen. So it doesn't matter what you say or whether it's true, as long as it's against them. It's against the left, or it's against the socialists or the liberals, right? Doing anything to own the libs. And then that manifests itself into a more free or open-air situation for fascism to arise. The left, on the other hand, or at least the establishment media in places like CNN and MSNBC and NBC, I've said this openly, that how much airtime they gave Trump and how much they capitulated to his strategies and his power because it was good for profits.
Right.
They capitulated and they were complicit because it benefited them in the short term. Right. And instead of taking the Enlightenment value approach, which stood for integrity and decency and consistency, they saw money, they saw dollar signs, and they decided that was more important. So it's not like, thanks CNN for fascism.
No.
But it certainly is not helping.
But I think, and again, like if you want to be more historically specific to this country, I would say that this objective journalism very unwittingly, the he said, she said structure of objective journalism, which was the dominant mode from the mid 20th century to very recently. Also, just no one ever thought that anyone would be so audacious as to come in and just say whatever they wanted.
Yeah.
But, objective journalism had to cover both because it's both sides, or it's all sides.
That's how the AP sold their paper. They shot down the middle.
It's like you can't, it's fascinating. Yeah.
I want to read one more section before we wrap up, and
we
just basically plug the book a million times again. This is from page 22. Classical liberals interpreted liberty as individual personal freedom, preferring limited constitutional government and a laissez-faire economy to any kind of state intervention, whether mercantilist, as in the early 19th century, or socialist, as later on. Equality they understood as opportunity made accessible to talent by education. They accepted inequality of achievement and hence of power and wealth. Fraternity they considered the normal condition of free men, and they tended to regard public affairs as men's business, and therefore in no need of artificial reinforcement, since economic interests were naturally harmonious and the truth would win out in a free marketplace of ideas. This is the sense in which I use the term liberal in this book, and never in its current American meaning of far left. Conservatives wanted order, calm, and the inherited hierarchies of wealth and birth. They shrank both from fascist mass enthusiasm, from the sort of the total power fascists grasped for. They wanted obedience and deference, not dangerous popular mobilization, and they wanted to limit the state to the functions of a night watchman who would keep order while traditional elites ruled through property, churches, armies, and inherited social influence. Where simple authoritarianism sufficed, conservatives much preferred that. Some of them maintained their anti-fascist posture to the end. Most conservatives, however, were sure that communism was worse. They would work with the fascists if the left looked otherwise likely to win. And I think that is a textbook example and a case of how the GOP primary played out and all the alliances that were made by establishment conservatives who, in the earliest stages of the campaign, called him, like Mick Mulvaney, for instance. Look at Mick Mulvaney.
Yeah, right.
Just recently appointed as the new chief of staff, but also the budget director. Trump is a terrible human being, circa 2015.
Yeah.
2018, 3 years later,
amazing.
Best guy ever. I'm going to run his whole operation for him. Couldn't say anything bad about the guy. It is that complicity that does not rest on ideological or philosophical consistency and rather rests more on a consolidation and a gravitation towards power in any form it takes. So with that happy note,
happy holidays. Thanks,
holidays.
Joe. That's
Sarah,
such a great, really. So such a light note to end the year on.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely right.
Let's make 2019 less fascist than 2018. I think we can all get behind
less
that.
fascism in
Here's
2019.
to less fascism. All right, Sarah, thank you again for joining.
Great.
This is the longest research corner we've ever done, and I'm not regretting any of it.
No, it's great book. And
The Anatomy of
Happy New
Fascism
Year.
by Robert Paxton. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next year.